This is a short lecture on Gregory the Great. He was born around 540, dies in 604, born into a wealthy aristocratic family. His great-great-grandfather was Pope Felix III. When he was born, Justinian, who was the emperor in the east, was battling the Goths, a barbarian tribe in the west, over Rome. And they ground Rome down a lot. Years later, when Gregory became the Pope, he said, quote, "I have taken charge of an old and grievously shattered ship." Rome was rescued with Justinian's help from the Goths in 555, but she became so weakened that she fell easy prey to the Lombards in 568. The Lombards were a Germanic barbarian tribe who were causing lots of trouble in northern Italy, and they were more savage than the normal savages. They wore what's called a reverse mohawk. They shaved their head right down the middle, and they had long beards, and they were just fierce, out of control. They would cut the hands off of Romans and send them back into the city just to intimidate the citizens. So the Lombards were going to be a big challenge for Gregory, even when he became the Pope years later. And he had this tension because he was a strong Christian. He wanted to evangelize and reach the Lombards for Christ, but he also was fiercely loyal to Rome and wanted to protect the city. He retired from leadership in Rome to establish a monastery that followed the rule of St. Benedict. And because he established a monastery and he was wealthy and aristocratic, he could have easily become the abbot. But he said, no, I don't want to be in charge. The reason I established this monastery is so I could withdraw from the world and I could spend time in prayer and solitude and scripture. So he was living in a monastery that he started as a mere monk. And then in 579, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, ordered him to become his emissary in Constantinople. And Gregory didn't want to go, but he loved his people. He loved Rome, and so he went. And he was really kind of snobbish. Even in Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Empire, he never bothered to learn Greek. He didn't trust Greek. He said, this is a vague, slippery language, the language that heretics use to evade orthodoxy. In fact, there was a girl from the West living in Constantinople, and she once wrote Gregory a letter in Greek, and he refused to answer her because, come on, you know Latin. Talk to me in the right language. Well, the Pope brought him back, and at this time, as I mentioned, Rome was facing lots of issues. They had the Lombards who were attacking. They also had the plague and often famines and wheat shortages, which led many Roman people to try to hedge their bets. So they were Christian now, but they also began resorting to paganism and having it was really a sort of Christian paganism with a thin Christian veneer. They had pagan dates and pagan wells they renamed for Christians, and holy men and relics. So kind of syncretistic, as the Romans are trying to hedge their bets and pray to any god that will help them. In 589, the Tiber floods, the plague hits, and Pope Pelagius II dies. He dies in February 590. Gregory preaches his funeral, and then a mob carries him into church and forces him to become the next pope. Gregory doesn't want the job. He's happy just living in retirement in a monastery. He sends a letter to the emperor asking him to refuse to consent to this election. But Gregory's brother, who's prefect of Rome, intercepts the letter and sends another one to the emperor announcing Gregory's election, and the emperor confirms it. So Gregory becomes the pope in 590. And he doesn't want it. He wants to just live in seclusion in a monastery. In fact, he wrote a letter to a princess saying this, quote, "Under the pretense of being made a bishop, I am brought back into the world. For I am now more in bondage than ever I was as a layman. I have lost the deep joy of my quiet. And while I seem outwardly to have risen, I am inwardly falling down." Interesting just to contrast, I think, often in the West here, pastors are after bigger, larger, better success. Gregory was one of those who I don't want to be. He's a good administrator, just doesn't want to do it. He wants to be a holy person and devote himself to the Lord. He overdid it, though. He was quite ascetic, and his asceticism wrecked his health. By the end of his life, he spent most of his time in bed, racked by fever and gout. From 598 till he dies in 604, he's mostly in bed, daily expecting death, and suffering from his gout. From 603 on, the last year of his life, he asked others to pray with him that he would die. So this isn't great, right? I like that he didn't have great ambition for himself, but he also had a misplaced asceticism that wrecked his health and prematurely ended his life. He kept fasting even when he knew it was hurting him. Once he suffered so badly from stomach cramps that his monks had to force feed him. He was in so much pain he couldn't preach and even write down his lectures. One kind of comically sad example of what being really overly pious and misguided in asceticism, how it could wreck your health. When he was living in Constantinople, he disagreed with the Patriarch Eutychus over the nature of our resurrection bodies. Eutychus said they were not substantial after the resurrection. That's kind of the Greek way that disregards human body. Whereas Gregory said, no, they must be substantial because Jesus' body was. So they appeared before the emperor. The Eastern emperor heard both sides, chose that Gregory said, you have the right view here. But as they're leaving the meeting, both Gregory and Eutychus collapsed. Gregory became very sick but recovered. Eutychus died and was replaced. So just almost tragically comedic, where these really devout leaders of the church, the Patriarch Eutychus and Gregory, the papal emissary, they so wreck their health, they collapse after defending their theological views. Well, Gregory, when he became the Pope in 590, was Pope for 14 years, and he thought he was living in the end times, which is worth noting. Ever since Christ went back to heaven, every Christian, every age, has had Christians who rightly thought, yeah, we're living in the end times. For Gregory, it was, you have the Lombards, these savages that are cutting off people's hands and sending them back into the city. There's wars with the gods, there's plagues and famines, and Rome. The physical decay of Rome, wasn't that prophesied in Revelation, that Babylon would fall down? So he was pretty sure he was living in the last days, and so he took advantage. He emphasized missions to England, evangelizing the Lombards, evangelizing at home. He was a champion of monasteries. He was the first monk to become the Pope, and he was a champion for Benedict's rule. He wrote the Pastoral Rule, which was intended to educate the clergy, the priest, just like Benedict's rule was for monks. So he loved Benedict, was a monk himself, and said, I want to do for priests and bishops what Benedict did for monks. He also wrote the dialogues, which were his attempt to recapture the fame and popularity of the monastic movement. Gregory had two reasons for writing his dialogues. He said, I want to encourage the church, which is disheartened by war and famine, that God still works. And secondly, I want us to prepare for the return of Christ, which he thought would happen in his lifetime. The dialogues begin, he's talking to a deacon, Peter, and shares how, man, when I was a monk, I had all this time to be godly and pious, but now that I'm a pope and I'm active in the world, I'm slipping. And Peter wondered if Gregory's not exaggerating the past, especially when he talked about how pious the saints used to be. And so in response, Gregory recites stories of the monks and how godly they were. Just a few of them that just to get a flavor of the dialogues. In book 1, there's a son who refused to eat the meat his mother had made. He says, I want fish, even though they're living high in the mountains and there's not any fish nearby. However, when a servant returned from fetching water for their meal, a fish slipped into his pail. And the son ate the fish, and his parents praised them. Once a boulder was tumbling down a mountain towards a monastery when the abbot raised his hands in the sign of the cross and invoked the name of Christ, and the boulder stopped in its tracks. Once Benedict was overcome by temptation with thoughts of a woman, and he saw a thick patch of nettles and briars, and so he took off his clothes, and his naked body just jumped into the briars and nettles, and then started rolling around, and until his whole body was in pain and covered with blood, and that made the lustful thoughts stop. Once Benedict was visiting his sister Scholastica, and as night fell, he wished to go back to the monastery, but she said, "Don't go. Quote, let us keep on talking about the joys of heaven till morning." But he refused. "No, I have to go." So she began praying for rain. And soon a cloud burst struck, and Benedict, it was raining so hard that he couldn't even step outside. He complained bitterly, "God forgive you, sister. What have you done?" But he spent the night there, in which they spoke all night long of the joys of heaven. And 3 days later, she died. And Benedict knew that she had died when he saw a white dove flying up to heaven, which he thought represented her spirit. Here's my favorite story from the dialogues. This is from Book 3. A priest loved his wife like a sister, but he avoided her like an enemy. He never went near her. So that they would not become familiar and he might sin by her. Quote, after a long life, 40 years of which he spent in the priestly ministry, he was seized with a severe fever and brought to the point of death. When his wife saw him lying there half dead, with all the strength of his body wasted away, she put her ear to his face, trying to catch the least sound of breathing. Conscious of her presence, he mustered all his strength, and with the little breath that was still in him, he rasped in a hoarse whisper, "Go away from me, woman. The fire is still flickering. Take away the tinder." That's pretty sad. That's the opposite of how God wants us to live, but it does show you how devout and pious and strident these people were. The pastoral care, the other thing that Gregory wrote, which was very popular in the Middle Ages. He didn't ever want to be the Bishop of Rome or the Pope, right? He wanted to just live in a monastery. And so he wrote pastoral care or to pastors, just like Benedict wrote the rule for monks. This was a rule for pastors to show them how to pastor well. And there's a handout that on Brightspace that shows you some select quotes from it. It was a popular book in the Middle Ages. I don't know that anything really quite stands out to me as like this is something you have to read, but it is a good encouragement for pastors' hearts and our motives and why we do what we do. And the basic takeaway for me is don't seek fame, don't seek a platform, don't seek influence, but seek Jesus and be content to be godly and let Jesus take care of the rest. So Pope Gregory was one of the great fathers of the faith. Very ascetic, monastic-minded, became pope against his will, and is known for sending missionaries into England and helping evangelize Great Britain, and also making Benedict and his rule popular until about 1100, thanks to Gregory's efforts. Benedict and his rule were the norm in monasteries throughout Europe until 1100, and also his pastoral care. So we'll talk more about this in class, but thanks for watching.